Hello, I'm Dr. Jim Cook.
And I'm Dr. Laura Harrawood.
Welcome to The Skilled Counselor.
This video is part of a series on individual and group counseling skills. In this particular video, we'll be talking about developing a psychoeducation group. More specifically, we'll focus on how to develop outlines to guide you through your group. The elements that we will be discussing today include the theme, the setup, the transition, the activity itself, and processing.
So probably the first thing that we need to address is what the heck are psychoeducational groups? Psychoeducational groups are a form of therapy designed to educate participants on a wide variety of mental health topics. So think of it as a group that educates clients on the very topics with which they struggle. So it could be a group on career exploration or parenting or anger management. Psychoeducational groups, however, go beyond the typical classroom style of learning. They take advantage of the therapeutic process that's inherent to groups. So, for example, members might learn how to give and receive feedback, they'll live vicariously through hearing others' experiences, and they feel support from other members who have similar problems. So now that we've defined it, it might be helpful to identify the elements of a psychoeducational group.
I've covered these briefly in our setup, but I want to go over them again. The elements of the psychoeducational group are the theme, the setup, the transitions, the activity itself, and process questions. So let's take a look at each one of these individually. First, the theme. When you think about the theme, think about it as the broader picture of what the group is. For each group, focus on a theme that relates to the purpose of the group. For example, the purpose of the group might be to decrease symptoms of depression, right? The theme of one of the sessions of the group might be to teach cognitive restructuring. So everything that you do in that group will address how to work with cognitions or our thoughts. That is the theme of that particular group. Jim?
So sometimes, when we're new to psychoeducational groups, we're anxious about doing them and we just want to get right to the activity. But really what we should be doing is something called the session setup. And a session setup is simply a summary of what members can expect that they'll be doing in the group. So it provides a focus for the session. Laura, earlier you were talking about cognitive restructuring. What would a setup look like for that?
Yeah, sure. So an example would be in today's session, we will be looking at how we think about events and interactions with others. We will do this by participating in an activity that will help you identify how you think and how your thoughts impact how you feel and behave. We will wrap up the session by reflecting on what we've learned. So I've gone from the beginning of the session, talking about what we're going to do, to the end of the session.
Yes. So, between each of the elements of the group, there's what we call a transition. And what a transition does, it moves the group from one focus to another. So in essence, what it's saying is, now that we've done X, we're moving on to Y. So it can be very basic by just simply stating, now that we've gone over the theme of the group, we'll talk about how to set it up.
So Jim, how is that exactly considered a basic transition?
Well, it's a basic transition because it doesn't add any meaning or depth to the description. It merely is just stating what happens.
Okay, so how does that differ then from a transition that might be more advanced?
Well, an advanced transition would seek to add more meaning or significance as to what and why we're doing the activity as we're moving forward in the group. Again, using our theme, an example of advanced transition would be, now that we have an understanding of what the focus will be of our group today, we will shift our attention to learning how thinking impacts our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
So then the next thing that you do is the actual activity, right? So the activity is the psychoeducational component that relates to achieving the objective that you have for that particular group. In essence, it is the theme of the group, right? So when choosing an activity, it's always good to ask yourself, will my group members participating in this activity result in the members learning what I want them to know? if you don't put any thought into your activity, you could
Mhm.
choose one that doesn't fit the theme. It's not advised to pick one on the fly. So choosing an activity needs to be purposeful. For example, a worksheet that's designed to teach the ABC model from REBT would be appropriate for a psychoeducational group whose theme is to address those symptoms of depression that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
So there's several things to keep in mind though when you're
Mhm.
setting up an activity. You can't just rush right into it. First, don't overload your group members. You want to give them time. So break the instructions down because if you give them a lot of instructions in a row, they're going to forget what the first one was. So give them time to set up. Maybe you're passing out markers. Give them time to the markers before you give them the next piece of instruction.
Yeah, and don't you think that one of the reasons why students who are learning how to run psychoeducational groups, they do it because they're they're anxious about it. They just want to
Yes.
get all the instructions out so that
Mm-hmm.
they've already said what they need to say, but really it can be more confusing is what you're saying in the end.
Absolutely. And you've got to be in touch with where your group members are and
Yeah,
how they're listening to the instructions and how much of it they're actually getting.
absolutely. So that's a lot of good stuff. What else do you think is important to remember when facilitating an activity?
I think it's important to let them know before the activity whether or not the information is going to be shared. Because if you know that the information's private, you're going to answer the questions a little bit differently than if you knew that you were going to share them with all the group members, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So, okay, we've talked about how to structure an activity. Let's move on to those wonderful process questions.
Yes, process questions. So, process questions are often the bane of students' existence. They're kind of, when you're first learning them, they're sort of challenging, but we're going to give you some guidelines as to when to use them and kind of how to do them. What process questions are they're just simply questions that are designed in such a way to determine what was helpful, meaningful, or significant about a group experience. And there are
Mhm.
two common places that we see process questions at the end of activities, and then also at the very end of a group.
Okay.
Okay, so let's talk about at the end of an activity. So after completing an activity, the group worker might have in mind 2 to 3 questions that would encourage members to think about their experience and kind of how it personally impacted them.
Oh, okay. So I've got an example for one.
Yeah,
So after completing the worksheet on the application of the ABC model, because we've just done it, the
right.
leader could ask the question, how does identifying your beliefs change how you feel?
Yeah. So another one at the end of the group, or at the end of the group, we talked about at the end of an activity. How about at the end of a
Mhm.
group? You want to focus members' experience of the entire session, right? So we did after an activity. Now we want to take in mind the entire session, what they've
Mhm.
learned, what's helpful, what's significant. So, for example, at the end of the group, where members have learned the ABC model, a leader might ask.
How did our group work together today? So I'm shifting from how we did for the activity to the absolute end of the session. So,
Yeah,
how did our group work together today to help each other identify our healthy thoughts?
yeah.
So, that focuses on group process versus just the activity that we talked about earlier.
Yes.
And then we could talk about being in a working group.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
another process question could be, how can you see the ABC worksheet being
Mhm.
used this week, right? So the process question focuses on what we call transfer of learning. It asks members how the worksheet can help them between sessions.
Yeah. So I would just add too that you've got this list of process questions, but the best process questions are contextual. So this means that the questions that you ask are relevant to that particular group. So, for example, if you've noticed that your group members are having a hard time working together today, to complete the worksheet that we're talking about, you might
Mhm.
ask a question like, what can we do next time to support one another to participate in the group? So that focuses exactly on behaviors that you saw in the group, and it's more meaningful to your group's development than picking one that you pre wrote off of a piece of paper.
Yeah. Another common one that I see is, let's say that I'm in my session and I've completed my activity and I've planned 4 process questions,
Mhm.
but I'm noticing that I just don't have time, that I need to move on. What should I do?
I think you have to practice, first of all, your active listening. So you know what's already been answered. So don't pick one of the questions that's already been answered.
Yes,
And so again, is there one that's more meaningful that you could ask and just throw out all the ones you've prepared ahead of time? Or
right,
is there one on that list that is the most important for that particular group, something the group members haven't learned or you haven't talked about yet? But
sure.
don't try to cram all of them in if you don't have enough time.
Right. So the important you need to do something, is what we're saying,
Mhm.
to reflect back on the experience, but only do the ones that are most important. And if you really are out of time, just do one, but get
Mhm.
something in right at the end of the activity or at the end of a group. So I think we've covered it, Dr. Harrawood. These are the
Mhm.
elements of a psychoeducational group. But before we go, we want to kind of leave you with the thought of, it's important that you be prepared for your psychoeducational groups. Know your outline well. Don't read from it as you're
Mhm.
doing your group. Always have a good grasp of the purpose of the activities. Faking it doesn't work well, because you will look ill prepared and you could lose credibility in the eyes of your clients. Nobody wants that. It's also not in the best interest of your client. So take the time to put some thought into creating an outline with the elements that we reviewed in this video.
Well, thanks for viewing Elements of a Psychoeducational Group. Be sure to like and subscribe and look for other helpful videos that address individual and group counseling.